Well, Sue Moroney.
Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise and speak to the second reading of the Education Amendment Bill number 2. And I do want to thank the previous speaker, the chairperson of our Select Committee, Alan Peachey, does a very fine job in the chair. And it is interesting to note that he was right, that we did have a very strong sense of cooperation on our committee, particularly when the ministry wanted to bring some late information into this amendment bill. And because, even though we're the opposition, we thought, well, look, these issues are important and they are appropriate for this bill, so we will actually accord the government our agreement to make sure that that happens. But, Mr Speaker, we find ourselves debating this bill under urgency. And it's kind of ironic, really, because while we were prepared to make sure that we gave the government the time in the Select Committee to actually address some issues that came late to the table, we do find that we are going through using urgency time in Parliament to actually debate, which should be a standard bill that should go through under normal processes. However, here we are debating it under urgency, and I want to focus on the part of the bill that impacts on the portfolio that I'm involved in, early childhood education, because there are substantial changes to the lowering of standards for limited attendance centres. And I think, as other members have already described, limited attendance centres are described in this bill as those sorts of facilities that we would think of that we might use when we go to the gym or the shopping centre. So they're defined in the bill as being a early childhood education setting where children will not be there for any longer than 2 hours in one day. And so I think people will imagine the sorts of settings that those are in. But, Mr Speaker, this is a bit of a thing with this government, lowering standards when it comes to early childhood education and with our very vulnerable children. And I just want to read from a very, very good submission we got before our Select Committee on this bill on the matter of limited attendance centres, and it was from the Human Rights Commission. And they had this to say, and I do want to read their actual words because I think they tell us about the human rights aspects that are under threat with the passing of this bill, and one of the main reasons why Labour opposes it. The Commission said it is concerned due regard does not appear to have been given to the vulnerability of babies, infants and young children attending limited attendance centres, and that the steps required to ensure their physical and emotional safety and well-being. They said that they understood that there is doubt as to whether staff in the limited attendance centres would be required to undergo a police vetting check. And of course, this is not their words now, but what we found when we closely questioned officials about that is that in fact this bill completely does away with the requirement of police vetting checks for these centres. The Commission said that they welcomed the Minister's reassurance during the bill's first reading that it was not the bill's intention to remove police vetting. But of course we know now that that intention was not followed through. We strongly recommend that such checks remain mandatory for any staff member who has unsupervised access to young children, and that the Select Committee identifies what measures are necessary to enforce such a requirement. And there were members of the Select Committee who did exactly what the Human Rights Commission asked for. They were members of the Labour Party and the Green Party. And those issues are detailed in the minority, I'm sad to say, Mr Speaker, minority reports of the Select Committee. Because while the Human Rights Commission was asking the entire Select Committee to identify measures that were necessary to look after vulnerable children, it was only the Labour Party and the Green Party who were determined to actually make a stand on that issue. They go on to say the Commission would be concerned if deregulation of limited attendance centres reflected any perception that caring for a group of young children is unskilled work with few responsibilities, or that it does not require training. But of course that is the view of the National Government, and we know this, not only because of what they have done with this bill, but because of their determination to reduce the number of qualified staff in the early childhood education sector right across the board. Because, Mr Speaker, in the budget this year, one of the largest cuts to any portfolio was to early childhood education. And that cut was meted out in particular to centres that dared to go after the goal that Labor set in government of having 100% qualified staff. 100% qualified staff. And what this government has said, John Key and Anne Tolley, they have said our children in New Zealand they just don't deserve 100% qualified staff. They don't matter, 80% is good enough. And that's exactly the attitude that we can see coming through in this bill, because it is actually the view of the National Party that they don't understand that these young children are engaged in early childhood education. They do see early childhood education as being glorified babysitting. And so that's why they have taken the knife to qualified teaching staff in the Early Childhood Education Centre, and it is why they have moved to completely remove any standards, any form of regulation from these limited attendance centres. The Human Rights Commission went on to say that if these that what the safeguards that they wanted to ensure as a very bottom line, they wanted to ensure were in place were these. They wanted someone qualified and first aid available at all times. The national government, the government members on the Select Committee didn't see fit to do that. They wanted sufficient staff available, including cover for times when a staff member may need to locate a parent urgently. And the government members didn't see fit to do that for limited attendance centres. The Human Rights Commission wanted, as just a bare minimum, staff aware of relevant child protection and abuse protocols. The government members wouldn't even agree to that. And the last minimum that the Human Rights Commission wanted was adequate records so that staff can ensure children do not attend for more than 2 hours a day. The government members on the Select Committee could not even agree to that as a basic, very, very basic level of protection for preschool children. So the Human Rights Commission, in their very, very well thought out submission, unfortunately for the majority of the Select Committee, the government members, that fell on completely deaf ears. And it fell on completely deaf ears because really this government fundamentally does not believe in the value of early childhood education. They do not understand what the Commission was in fact saying was that there is a vulnerability of babies, of infants and young children, and they do deserve protection. And parents and families look to the government for that protection. Because I believe this, that in a country like New Zealand, a country that has always had very high educational standards, that parents, when they drop their children off at a limited attendance centre, at a creche, in a gym or at a shopping centre, will expect that there will be some minimum standards in place for the people who are charged with looking after their children. They will expect in a country like New Zealand that the government has the courage to make sure that their children would be safe, that at the very least there would be police checks, and as my colleague Trevor Mallard said, a line of sight, for example, just some very basic things that actually ensure the protection of young children when they are away from their parents or their primary caregiver. That's not too much to ask. Very, very basic standards. But the government members could not even bring themselves to recommend that. They've left, I think it's not too extreme. They are potentially leaving these babies, these infants and these children at the hands of potential sex abusers that the police already know about. And what will their response be when that happens? I would like to say if that happens, but I think my colleague Trevor Mallard is right, that the people who operate in this field will look for these opportunities, they will see this gap, they will know that they can have access to young children unsupervised by their parents without having to face a police vet check. And I think that the government should think very seriously about the vulnerability of the children and the position that they are putting them in, and I really do hope that during the committee stages